Hello, and welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration public meeting for the Draft Air Tour Management Plan for the San Francisco Bay Area National Parks. My name is Michelle Carter. I am an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be your moderator this evening. I'd like to start off by defining a couple of acronyms that you'll hear us use throughout the meeting this evening. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as the NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as the FAA, and the Air Tour Management Plans as ATMPs. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP for the Bay Area parks and to seek public feedback on the draft. This meeting is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You'll hear a little bit more about NPATMA and the draft ATMP here shortly, along with information on how you can submit questions and your official comments. But before we dive into the presentations, I'd like to take a minute and introduce our presenters and provide you with a little bit more information about meeting logistics and how you can participate. Next slide, please. So joining us this evening as presenters are Eric Elmore, a senior policy advisor with the Office of Environment and Energy with FAA. From the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, we have Vicky Ward, an overflights program manager. And then from the NPS, we have Laura Joss, the superintendent of Golden Gate National Recreation Area and Muir Woods National Monument, and Allison Forrestal, the Chief of Resources Management and Science for Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Eric and Vicky are going to provide a brief overview of NPATMA and the purpose of today's meeting, and then we'll hear from Superintendent Joss and Allison, who will provide us with a little bit more information from the park's perspective and park-specific resources in the context of the draft ATMP. Next slide, please. Throughout the meeting, we invite you to go ahead and submit your questions, which will be addressed after the presentations as part of our Q&A session. The questions submitted through today's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they continue developing the draft ATMP, but they're not considered formal comments. Next slide, please. All official comments must be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment Site, or PEPC as we know it, or sent to the mailing addresses that is listed on the PEPC site. Only comments received one of these two ways will become part of the official record, and the comments need to be submitted on or before November 15th. The agencies are not actually accepting official comment via email, and I'll share a little bit more information about this later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So this meeting is being live streamed across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're watching on one of these platforms, you can submit your questions using the link to a Google form that FAA will post in the little chat area of the platform that you're using. When the time comes, we'll read the questions aloud and do our best to respond to everything that comes in. If for some reason we don't get to all of the questions, we will provide contact information at the end where you can go for post-meeting follow-up. And that'll be an email address. And again, just to clarify, that email won't be for official comments, but more for clarifying questions if you need more information from the NPS team to better provide a comment on the plan. So if you're just listening in and maybe not watching online, you may want to run out and grab a pen and have it handy to jot down this information when the time comes towards the end of this presentation. The overall meeting will be 90 minutes long, and we plan to adjourn at 6 p.m. Pacific time. If we get through all of the questions early, we plan to keep the meeting active until 6 o'clock, just in case additional questions come in. And please note, the meeting is going to be recorded. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about this draft ATMP. We're going to now play a short overview video before I turn it over to Eric and Vicky to provide additional details about NPATMA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans, and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft Air Tour Management Plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Thanks, Michelle, and welcome everybody. My name is Eric Elmore, and I am a Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Environment and Energy with the Federal Aviation Administration. Today, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the National Parks Air Tour Management Program, and I will also have the assistance of my colleague, Vicky Ward, in this presentation. Next slide. So the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, or NEPATMA, requires the Federal Aviation, in cooperation with the National Park Service, to develop an Air Tour Management Plan, ATMP, for those parks and tribal lands where operators have applied to conduct commercial air tours. The Act applies to commercial air tours that fly within a half mile of the park boundary, over the park or within a half mile of the park boundary, over tribal lands within or abutting a park, and they have to be in the airspace that is 5,000 feet above ground level AGL. Next slide, please. So NEPATMA does not apply to general aviation, commercial airline, or military flights. It's limited to air tour operations only that occur over national parks. NEPATMA also does not apply to drones, so that is something that is not covered by NEPATMA either. The Act does not apply to Alaska parks, Grand Canyon National Park, or Rocky Mountain National Park. In 2012, NEPATMA was amended, and it provided that parks with 50 or fewer reported flights per year are exempt from developing an air tour management plan unless the exemption is withdrawn by the Park Service. And finally, if an abutting tribal lands are or may be overflown, the tribes must be invited as cooperating agencies for purposes of complying with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Next slide, please. So the Act applies to commercial air tour operators, and they have to apply to FAA for operating authority in order to operate over national park system units and abutting tribal lands. The commercial air tour operators generally, they fall into two categories. They're either existing commercial air tour operators or new entrant commercial air tour operators. I don't believe there are any new entrant commercial air tour operators at this park. And I think I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Vicky Ward, now to provide you some more information.
Thanks, Eric. I'm Vicky Ward. I'm the Overflights Program Manager in the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division in the National Park Service, and I'll continue with the overview of NPATMA and air tour management plans. An air tour management plan has a specific objective that is contained in the Act, and that is it needs to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, resulting from commercial air tour operations upon natural and cultural resources, visitor experiences, and tribal lands. Next slide. The Act also specifies what the contents of an air tour management plan may include or must include. And an air tour management plan may prohibit commercial air tour operations in whole or in part. So that could be over the entire park, could be just over part of the park. It could be different times a year would not have air tours. Air tour management plan may also establish conditions for the conduct of air tour operations. So that includes the routes, the altitudes, time of day restrictions, restrictions for particular events, such as a ceremony or other special event going on at a park, and also the maximum number of flights, which could be on a daily basis, a yearly basis, or some other specified time frame. And as mentioned earlier, it only applies to the commercial air tour operations that are within 1/2 mile outside the boundary of the national park or below 5,000 feet above ground level. An air tour management plan must include incentives for the adoption of quiet technology aircraft. These are aircraft that are quieter than the standard models, and each air tour management plan does include those incentives. And it also must provide for the allocation of opportunities to conduct air tours when the air tour management plan limits the number of operations. And each air tour management plan also includes a section that justifies and documents the need for any specified altitudes, routes, or any of the other operating conditions that may be contained in the air tour management plan. And those measures are documented in the ATMP and also included in the record of decision that goes with the Environmental Policy Act documentation. Next slide. And for those of you who might be calling in and can't see the screen, this is a picture of a map of the United States, and that shows the locations of the parks where FAA and NPFs are working on concurrently air tour management plans for 24 parks. So we have several in the Eastern US. Those public meetings were earlier this year. We obviously are here for the 4 San Francisco Bay Area parks. We also have a cluster of parks in Southern Utah, 2 in Washington State, and then the 2 parks in Hawaii. Next slide. And as required by the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, the agencies publish the proposed air tour management plan in the Federal Register. We hold at least one public meeting to get feedback from the public on the contents of that air tour management plan. And each air tour management plan is a federal action, so it will comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and other legal requirements such as Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. And we also invite tribes to participate as cooperating agencies for NEPA compliance in cases where tribal lands are or may be overflown. That particular situation does not apply to this draft air tour management plan, but it does to a few other parks we're working on. And as we've mentioned before, our meeting today is to go over the components of the draft air tour management plan and have folks who are watching this meeting ask questions about it. And with that, I will turn it back over to Michelle. And thank you for attending today's meeting.
Great, thank you, Eric and Vicky. And now we'll go ahead and turn it over to the parks and hear from Superintendent Joss and Allison from the parks perspective.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Joss. Good evening. I'm General Superintendent of Golden Gate National Recreation Area and Muir Woods National Monument. And on behalf of Craig Kenkel, Superintendent of Point Reyes National Seashore, and Dave Brulette, Superintendent of San Francisco Maritime National Historic Site, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today's virtual public meeting. One of our key goals tonight is to hear from all of you about the draft air tour management plan and to answer any questions you may have. Your input is very important to us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Commercial air tours have been taking place over portions of our Bay Area national parks since before the National Parks Air Tour Management Act was passed. And this process gives us the opportunity to set the terms and conditions for those flights in collaboration with the Federal Aviation Administration. With that, I'd like to introduce Golden Gate National Recreation Area's Chief of Natural Resources and Science, Allison Forrestal, who will be providing an overview of the draft air tour management plan for Golden Gate, Point Reyes, Muir Woods, and San Francisco Maritime. Allison?
Thank you for the introduction, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. As Laura said, I'll be talking about some of the details in the draft air tour management plan for our 4 San Francisco Bay Area national parks. But before I get into that, I'll just talk briefly about each of the parks that are covered in this draft air tour management plan. So first, I'll talk about Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Golden Gate spans from Marin County in the north through San Francisco and San Mateo County south of the Golden Gate Bridge. It includes over 80,000 acres of wildlands and urban areas, as well as offshore tidal and submerged lands in Marin and San Francisco counties. Golden Gate includes a wide variety of cultural and popular visitor sites, including the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz Island, and Crissy Field. In addition, Golden Gate has a vast treasure of natural resources, including 19 separate ecosystems, many different watersheds, and more than 1,250 plant and animal species. Next slide, please. Also in San Francisco is San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park. San Francisco Maritime is a 50-acre park located at the heart of the northern waterfront of San Francisco. The focus of San Francisco Maritime is to promote the understanding and enjoyment of the nation's West Coast maritime heritage. And San Francisco Maritime boasts the largest and most diverse collection of national historic landmark ships in the entire country. Next slide, please. Working our way north into Marin County is Muir Woods National Monument. Muir Woods was created to protect one of the last remaining old growth forests in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a 558-acre monument, and it protects coast redwood trees that are close to 1,000 years old and up to 250 feet tall. Muir Woods is one of the places that visitors come from all over the world to see old growth redwood forests, and it sees nearly 1 million visitors per year. Next slide, please. And then the 4th and final park covered under our draft air tour management plan is Point Reyes National Seashore in coastal West Marin County. Point Reyes encompasses more than 70,000 acres of incredible coastal habitats, including beaches, cliffs, headlands, marine terraces, forests, coastal uplands, as well as the tidal and submerged lands offshore, similar to Golden Gate. On the offshore lands, Point Reyes includes 2 no-take state marine reserves, 3 special closure areas, 3 state marine conservation areas, as well as 2 ranching historic districts. And then the last unique thing I'll say about Point Reyes is that it includes the Philip Burton Wilderness, which is an almost 33,000 acre wilderness area. And it includes marine areas, including Drake Sestero, which makes it one of only 2 marine wilderness areas in the entire national park system. Next slide, please. So this map just depicts the 4 parks I was just talking through. You can see Point Reyes in the northern part of this map with the gold boundary, and the Philip Burton Wilderness is highlighted in the green hash. The boundary of Golden Gate National Recreation Area is shown in red in this map. In Marin County, a little bit difficult to see at this scale of this map, but you can see Muir Woods. Yep, thank you, with the green dot there. And then in San Francisco, in the northern waterfront, is San Francisco Maritime. Also shown on this map are the Commodore Center and San Francisco International Airport, which are the 2 locations that the 2 commercial air tour operators covered in this draft ATMP fly out of. And because those 2 operators fly over 3 of the 4 parks in this plan, we've decided to combine them all into one draft air tour management plan, since it's the same operators doing these commercial air tours. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening right now with commercial air tours over our San Francisco Bay Area national parks. So the 2 air tour operators that I just mentioned hold interim operating authority, or IOA for short, for a total of 5,090 flights per year per park. And that's really the only restriction on commercial air tours over these parks at the present time. There's no other restrictions on the routes that they take, the time of day. There's no restrictions under NEPATMA for altitude, procedures for no fly periods, et cetera. So that's what's currently permitted. Next slide, please. And then this slide goes into what's actually happening right now. So there's the 5,090 flights permitted per park per year under the interim operating authority. But what's actually being flown in terms of commercial air tours over the period of 2017 to 2019, these are the average number of flights per year. At Golden Gate National Recreation Area, 2,548 flights per year. And at San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park, also 2,548 flights per year. The reason these 2 numbers are exactly the same is that because when a commercial air tour flies over Golden Gate, it also flies over San Francisco Maritime. So each flight passes over both of those units at the same time. Of those 2,548 flights, 143 of them also pass over Point Reyes National Seashore. And then for the last number of years, the commercial air tour operators have been doing voluntary avoidance of Muir Woods National Monument. So we have a 3-year average over this period of 0 flights per year at Muir Woods. Next slide, please. Okay, so now this is really getting into the nuts and bolts of what's in the draft air tour management plan. And I'm going to start here by just talking through what this table is showing. So the column on the left, called category, just shows the different types of information in the draft air tour management plan. So the number of tours per year, the altitudes at which these tours can fly, the types of aircraft, et cetera. The center column describes the existing conditions for air tours, what's happening right now. And then the column on the right, labeled draft ATMP, describes what's proposed in our draft ATMP for each of these categories. So now kind of having explained the layout here, I will talk through each of the rows in this table. So the first row is the number of air tours authorized per year. And as I was describing on the last slide, there's this interim operating authority for 5,090 flights per park per year. And then the number of flights actually being flown is 2,548 over Golden Gate and San Francisco Maritime, 143 flights per year over Point Reyes, and none over Muir Woods due to the voluntary avoidance. And so what's being proposed in the draft ATMP is really formalizing what's actually been happening. So the draft ATMP would permit 2,548 flights. These flights would pass over both Golden Gate and San Francisco Maritime. And then of these, 143 flights would be permitted to also pass over Point Reyes. And under the draft ATMP, no flights are authorized to pass over Muir Woods National Monument. Going down to the next row, talking about altitude, which is sometimes referred to as AGL, or feet above ground level. So right now, these air tour operators don't have any restrictions in terms of their altitude under the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, and their reported altitudes are between 800 and 2,500 feet AGL. And what's being proposed in the draft ATMP is that the fixed wing aircraft, or the seaplane, would fly no lower than 1,500 to 2,500 feet AGL, depending on location, and the helicopters would fly no lower than 1,000 to 1,500 feet AGL, again, depending on locations. And when we get into the route maps in a couple of slides, we'll talk about some of those locations. In terms of aircraft type, existing conditions, no restrictions. And then under the draft ATMP, the seaplane and the helicopter would be permitted at Golden Gate and San Francisco Maritime, and only the seaplane would be permitted to fly over Point Reyes National Seashore. Next slide, please. Okay, time of day restrictions. Currently, there are none. Under the draft ATMP for Golden Gate National Recreation Area and San Francisco Maritime, the flights would be restricted from 9 a.m. in the morning until 30 minutes after sunset. And at Point Reyes National Seashore, they would be restricted from noon to 5 p.m. each day. In terms of days of the week, there are currently no restrictions on which days flights may occur. And there wouldn't be any preset restrictions under the draft ATMP, but the National Park Service would have the ability to establish temporary no-fly periods for special events or other special park management needs. And then this last row just talks about required reporting and additional requirements. And really the only other requirement worth noting under the existing conditions is a semi-annual reporting requirement. Under the draft ATMP, that semi-annual reporting requirement would be continued. There would also be operator training when made available by the NPS, an option for an annual meeting between the operators, FAA, and the NPS. And for Point Reyes National Seashore, there would be restrictions on the number of daily air tours. So it would be restricted to 1 per day with 5 flex days per year. And on the flex days, there would be the ability to fly 2 flights per day over Point Reyes. Next slide, please. Okay, so this map shows the proposed routes under the draft air tour management plan. There's a lot going on this map because it shows all of the routes and all of the parks. And on the subsequent slides, I'll be able to get into the details of each of these proposed routes. And really, I just have a few things I want to point out on this slide. One is that each of the routes has a solid portions of the line and then dashed portions of the route line. And what that is referring to is where the route goes in and out of the jurisdiction of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. As both Eric and Vicky mentioned, NPATMA covers the area, the airspace over the parks and within a half-mile buffer from the park's boundaries. So the solid line is where the route is within that half-mile buffer. And the dashed line is where the route goes outside of the half-mile buffer and is no longer under the jurisdiction of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. Let's see, the Commodore Center and San Francisco Airport are also shown on this slide. So pointing those out again, since those are where the 2 air tour operators are flying out of. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is just that all of these maps are available for download from the Pepsi site as part of the draft air tour management plan. So I invite all of you to download the plan and look at these maps in greater detail so you can pore over all of these notes and more of the detail than I can go into here. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the proposed helicopter routes. You can see that these are centered more over San Francisco and Southern Marin. They fly out of both the Commodore Center and the San Francisco Airport. The minimum AGL for the helicopter operators in general is 1,000 feet, but there are a few places where there is a minimum AGL of 1,500 feet. And you can see that on the bottom 2 panels of this figure right there, yep, and on the figure to the right as well. In those 2 places, where the helicopter route passes over Tennessee Valley, there's the potential to pass over northern spotted owl habitat, which is why there's the higher AGL in those locations. The other item I wanted to point out on this slide is the avoidance of Alcatraz Island. So Alcatraz is shown here with a blue triangle on each of these panels. And in order to protect the nesting seabird colonies on Alcatraz, there's a required lateral avoidance of 1,000 feet from Alcatraz Island, as well as avoidance from Angel Island, the larger island just to the north. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the two proposed seaplane tour routes over Golden Gate and San Francisco Maritime in the green and the blue here. The route that passes over Point Reyes is shown in red, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So for the fixed wing seaplane flights, the minimum AGL in all cases is at least 1,500 feet altitude above ground level. And you can see here, we also have the lateral avoidance of Alcatraz of 1,000 feet to protect nesting shorebirds, as well as the avoidance of Angel Island. You can also see here a little bit more clearly than on some of the other figures, Muir Woods shown kind of in the, yep, right there, thank you. And you can see that there's a very significantly large avoidance of Muir Woods of all of these proposed routes. Okay, and I think that's it for this one. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is the proposed air tour route over Point Reyes National Seashore. Again, the minimum AGL in all cases is at least 1,500 feet above ground level for these flights. And in some places it's higher. So where this route crosses over the land-based portions of the Philip Burton Wilderness, the minimum AGL is 2,000 feet. To protect soundscapes and wilderness character. This route also avoids the ranch core areas out on the San Francisco Peninsula, and it avoids the sensitive marine mammal habitat at Duxbury Reef and Double Point in the southern part of the Point Reyes Peninsula. Next slide, please. So just to talk a little bit about the justification for some of the measures taken in this draft ATMP. I mentioned earlier northern spotted owls. They're a federally threatened species. And throughout the draft ATMP, all flights that pass over northern spotted owl habitat are required to have a minimum of 1,500 feet above ground level in order to protect the spotted owls from any noise disturbance. Wilderness was also a special consideration in this draft ATMP because of the Philip Burton Wilderness at Point Reyes National Seashore. And as I just mentioned, all flights passing over land-based wilderness are required to have a minimum of 2,000 feet AGL in order to protect wilderness character and visitor experience while in the wilderness. Seabirds and marine mammals were also an important consideration, which is why there's the 1,000-foot lateral avoidance around Alcatraz Island, as well as from other known seabird colonies, peregrine falcon nests, and marine mammal haulouts in order to protect these wildlife from noise impacts. And then lastly, Muir Woods, the draft air tour management plan would continue the avoidance of Muir Woods with none of the routes passing over Muir Woods. And this is really to protect natural soundscapes in the woods and the natural resources within Muir Woods. And so with that, I will pass it back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Allison. That was a really great presentation, I think, in regards to the park-specific aspects of this draft ATMP. As was mentioned earlier, the development of this draft air tour management plan is a federal action that requires the agencies to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA. NEPA requires the agencies to consider the human and natural environment that could be affected by this air tour management plan. We're required to determine the appropriate level of NEPA review and then to prepare the associated environmental review documents. At this time, the agencies have conducted an initial impact analysis, and we are considering developing this air tour management plan under an NPS categorical exclusion. And I do want to make clear that a categorical exclusion does not mean that it is excluded from complying with the NEPA. A categorical exclusion is a way to comply with NEPA. So we are currently considering, public comments on this air tour management plan. as well as information obtained during the 106 consultation and the Section 7 consultations. And we will fully assess the environmental impacts from all of these various processes that are going on before we make a final decision on the appropriate level of environmental review. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, one of the other statutes that we are complying with is the National Historic Preservation Act. And Section 106 requires us to consult on that in regards to historic properties. So Section 106 is basically a 4-step process, and it includes the requirements that the agencies define the undertaking and identify consulting parties. It requires us to determine the area of potential effect, or the APE, and identify historic properties within the APE. It requires us to assess the effects of this air tour management plan on those historic properties. And finally, we are required to resolve adverse effects, if any are found, to these historic properties. The agencies have initiated consultation with the relevant State Historic Preservation Officer, or SHPO, tribes, and other consulting parties. And with that, I will hand it over, I believe, to Michelle to discuss the Endangered Species Act.
Great. Yep. Well, thank you all. Thanks so much to Superintendent Joss, to Allison, and to Eric for that very thorough overview. We appreciate the information. And so in the context of Section 7, Allison kind of alluded to this, but the FAA and the National Park Service are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act as they develop the draft ATMP. The purpose of this is to ensure that the proposed action doesn't jeopardize the existence of any species listed under ESA or result in the destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat. The agencies have begun informal consultation conversations with both the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the preliminary assessment by the agencies is not anticipating these types of impacts. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier, we're currently inviting comment from the public, from tribes, from other agencies, and all interested parties on the draft ATMP. And comments need to be in on or before November 15th. A reminder that comments can be submitted one of two ways, either online through the NPS public comment website, and you'll see the link here on the screen, or by mail to the address, again, listed here on the screen. And I had mentioned this earlier, but just affirming that they're not actually accepting comment via email. I also wanted to point you to an FAQ document that's posted on the ATMP site. It's right next to the draft ATMP. And as Allison mentioned earlier, if you're interested in seeing more detailed maps, you can also find those on the Park Pepsi page. If somebody from FAA could drop that link into the chat of the social media platforms, it might make it easier for folks to access those sites. Okay, next slide, please. So following the end of this public comment period, the FAA and the NPS will review all of the comments and will use them to inform the final ATMP. We'll continue to coordinate and complete the tribal, the Section 106 and the Section 7 consultations, and the NEPA process will then be concluded by signing a decision document. Once this is wrapped up, the ATMP will be considered complete, and it'll be available on both the FAA and the National Park Service websites. And FAA will then follow up by updating the operations specifications for each air tour operator. Next slide, please. Okay, and with that, I'd like to say thank you to the presenters, and we'll now turn into the Q&A portion of our meeting. If anybody ended up maybe joining a little bit late, my name is Michelle Carter. I am an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm serving as the moderator for the meeting this evening. If you have a question that you want to submit, you can post it into a Google form using the link that FAA has shared in the chat area of the social media platform that you're using. Looks like maybe we've had a couple of questions come in already, so please keep them coming. And a reminder that the questions that are submitted through the meeting today will be considered by the agencies as they develop the draft ATMP, but they're not considered formal comments. I mentioned a bit ago, the formal comments must be submitted through the PEPC site or sent to the mailing address. I also mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that the duration that will be here is 90 minutes. We plan to adjourn at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And in the event that we have a lull and we come to the end of the questions that are submitted and we still have time, we'll keep the meeting active until 6 p.m. just to allow for additional questions to come in, to give you a chance to think about what you've heard, send in clarifying questions and comments, or think about maybe reactions or follow-up questions you have to other questions that may have come in. So that being said, turn it over here. And we'll start with the first question here. And Eric, we'll have you respond to this one. The question is, would you mind not going forward with this plan, please?
All right, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the question. So NEPATMA requires an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement for any park with more than 50 air tours. And further, without this ATMP, air tours over the park would continue to be managed and regulated only within the existing interim operating authority, or IOA cap, which is basically just a not to exceed number. And so without an air tour management plan, as noted earlier, there would be no changes or improvements to the specific routes and altitudes or time of day restrictions that were designed to protect the park and natural and cultural resources. So we have to do a plan. If you don't like this plan, that's why we're having this meeting, and please provide comments as articulated earlier to the PEPC site if there are things you want to see differently. But thank you for the question.
Great, thanks, Eric. Okay, we do have another question here. We'll send this one over to Vicky. Vicky, the question is, how does completing only a categorical exemption, which I think it's categorical exclusion is what the question is, how does completing only a categorical exclusion fulfill the U.S. Court of Appeal mandate to provide complete NEPA reviews of ATMPs? And I know it was talked a little bit about during the presentations, but if you wouldn't mind coming on and giving some clarifying context.
Sure, Michelle, and thanks for the question. So first I'll start out with a little bit of what's involved in a NEPA review for federal agencies, and then so it's going to be a little bit detailed answer, and I need to look to the side just to make sure I'm explaining things correctly. So please pardon me that I'm not looking directly at the camera right now. So an environmental review under NEPA can involve 3 different levels of analysis. The first level is a categorical exclusion, and the next one's environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. And so based on the analysis that we've done to date, we are considering using an NPS categorical exclusion 3.3A1, which is from our NPS NEPA handbook, and that allows changes or amendments to an approved action when such changes will cause no or only minimal environmental impact. As we've mentioned, we have completed an initial analysis of effects consistent with NEPA. And so the type of documentation that is most appropriate to the analysis will be informed by the feedback we received during this public review period on the draft ATMP. So if there are any additional effects that are identified or not yet identified, and if there needs to be more analysis and a determination of whether or not there is the potential for adverse impacts, that would make a different NEPA pathway more appropriate. So we haven't made a final determination on the NEPA pathway. So like I said, we're considering comments we receive on the draft ATMP, information we obtained during the consultations, and then we fully assess the environmental impacts and then make a determination on which NEPA pathway is appropriate. So a categorical exclusion doesn't mean it's exempt from NEPA. It just means it's excluded from preparing environmental impact statement. And so as to regarding whether it fulfills what's the requirements of NEPATMA, NEPATMA requires that the agency sign the environmental decision document that's required by Section 102 of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, and provides a non-exhaustive list of the ways which the agencies may accomplish that. Application of a categorical exclusion is a level of NEPA review and a form of NEPA compliance where appropriate. NEPATMA does not preclude the application of a categorical exclusion. And if you have comments about the appropriate NEPA pathway for this draft air tour management plan, or about effects or ways to mitigate effects, please include them in your formal comments on the draft ATMP and Pepsi. And hopefully that answers the question. And back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Vicky, for that very thorough response. So for this next question, we're actually going to bring a new face on camera. I'd like to introduce Brandon Ketchum. He's a management analyst with the Reyes National Seashore. So Brandon, there's a question that came in asking if FAA has consulted with Fish and Wildlife Service regarding impacts to numerous threatened or endangered species that use the area under the plan: spotted owl, marbled murrelet, California least tern, fin sea, and blue whales, to name a few. And we did talk about this a little bit. I know Allison mentioned it, and I touched on it too, but if you'd be willing to come on and give a little bit more context for that, it would be appreciated.
Yeah, just as follow-up to what was in the presentation, for sure. We actually have met with Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service regarding the ATMP to discuss with them any concerns that they may have based upon what's proposed in the draft plan that was shared. Excuse me. So we, as mentioned, there are a number of federally recognized and protected threatened and endangered species, many mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, as well as plants, fish, and even insects. The commercial air tours, as they're proposed on the routing that Allison identified, with the minimum flight altitudes, the time of day restrictions, type of aircraft, et cetera, we believe we anticipate would have no effect on those species. Again, we've had those conversations and we'll continue to have those conversations with the agencies, but that is what has been discussed and really what drove a lot of the discussions and choices with respect to routing, as well as sort of lateral offsets, as well as elevations. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Brandon. And then we have another question that just came in that's also kind of tied to that, maybe a little bit of a different spin. And Vicky, we'll have you come on and provide some more information. The question is, how is the plan responsive to MMPA, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and ESA, Endangered Species Act, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act?
Okay, thanks, Michelle, and thanks for that question. And I think some of the answer to this has already been covered during the presentation and what Brandon mentioned. But in looking at the avoidance measures that are recommended for marine mammals and the endangered species that are in the area of this air tour management plan, and also other species under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, such as peregrine falcons. The air tours with fixed wing aircraft would fly no lower than 1,500 to 2,500 feet above ground level, and that depends on the location over the park. Helicopters will fly no lower than 1,000 to 1,500 feet AGL, and also depending on the location. And so the commercial air tours would also fly no lower than 2,000 feet above ground level over land-based wilderness and maintain at least 1,000-foot lateral avoidance of Alcatraz Island and 1,000-foot lateral avoidance of nesting shorebird colonies, peregrine falcon nests, and marine mammal haulouts. So these avoidance measures avoid or minimize potential effects on these species by reducing the noise intensity of the air tour events. And these also comply with guidelines that have been issued either by Fish and Wildlife Service or the NOAA for the marine sanctuary. So we took a really close look at all that during our review of these measures and how they comply with these particular acts. So thanks, and I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vicky. Just on a personal note here, I'm in Denver, Colorado, and we just started getting lightning and hail. So fingers crossed that my connectivity stays on, but I just wanted to mention that for the team in case something happens. But so far, so good. Okay, we do have another question that came in here, and we'll pass this question over to Eric. They're asking if there are other alternative plans and what is the range of alternatives that were considered?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the question. So as we are proceeding under categorical exclusion at this time, we don't necessarily have the range of alternatives that you might see in an EA process. But we encourage anyone who wants to see changes made to this draft ATMP to submit their comments in PEPC. But we do think this is a good plan because under interim operating authority, as was stated earlier, the operators are authorized to fly 5,090 air tours per year over the parks. And this draft ATMP, proposes to reducing those numbers to 25-48 annually. And it also provides a number of additional conditions in regards to flying specified routes, altitudes, aircraft type, day and time restrictions, as well as restrictions for particular events. So again, we encourage people to submit their comments to PEPC so that we can consider them. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eric. Okay, we had another question come in, and I think we'll go back over to Vicky for this one. They're asking if the NPS will collect a fee from the tour operators to cover the cost of administering the plan.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And the way air tour fees work is that the NPS is authorized to collect those fees under the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993. And it was very specific about which parks the Park Service could collect air tours fees for. So that currently is for the Grand Canyon National Park, Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and Haleakala National Park. And so we're not authorized to collect fees for flights over the Bay Area parks. And the ATM tour management plan would not change that. Thanks for the question. Back to you, Michelle.
Okay, great. So what we see on our end typically is a little bit of a delay from when the questions come in. And it looks like there are additional questions that are coming in right now. So as I mentioned earlier, as we have a little bit of a delay and we're getting those visible on our end, we will read them aloud, and it looks like actually one just came in for Eric. So Eric, the question we're seeing here is asking, how will this affect GA touring the bay and the Golden Gate Bridge?
All right, thank you, Michelle. And a little technical difficulty here. So, as previously stated, the NEPATMA only applies to commercial air tour operations, and there's a specific Code of Federal Regulation definition, and it's found at 14 CFR 136.33. And a commercial air tour is defined as any flight conducted for compensation or hire in a powered aircraft for sightseeing over a national park unit within 1/2 mile outside the boundary of a unit of the national park system, or over tribal lands during which the aircraft flies at or below a minimum altitude of 5,000 feet above ground level, AGL, except for takeoff or landing, or as necessary for safe operation of the aircraft under FAA regulations, or be less than 1 mile laterally from any geographic feature within the park, unless you're more than 1/2 mile outside the boundary. So commercial air tours do not include general aviation or commercial airline aircrafts or drone usage. So in essence, this NEPATMA does not cover general aviation aircraft. And from a safety perspective, I would say that FAA has looked at the proposed routes and altitudes and things of that nature, so, and the various airspaces, and have found this proposal safe. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thank you. You might hear a little bit of rumbling in the background from the thunder here. Hopefully it's not too distracting. So we have had another question come in, and we'd like to bring another new face on, Bill Merkel, a wildlife ecologist. And Bill, the question is, how will air tours affect snowy plovers at Crissy Field Wildlife Protection Area?
Hi there. The western snowy plover is a federally threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. And we do have overwintering snowy plovers at the beach at the Crissy Field Wildlife Protection Area from late in the summer or early fall through the spring. And at both Ocean Beach and Crissy Field, we have not observed snowy plovers reacting to aircraft flying above 1,000 feet. So we believe snowy plovers will not be affected by, it's just the helicopter that will fly by the beach at Crissy Field. So we believe snowy plovers will not be affected by helicopter overflights if they're more than 1,000 feet AGL.
Great, thanks for that clarification, Bill. Okay, moving on here again. We'll pass this next question over to Eric. Eric, they are asking, why would helicopters be permitted to fly lower than fixed-winged aircraft?
So thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the question. So typically helicopters fly lower than fixed-wing aircraft, and the operator's current altitudes on these current routes kind of reflect that fact. What it does, it provides altitude separation between two different types of aircraft. Some are faster and flying higher, the fixed wings. And then you have the helicopters that are slower moving and flying at a lower altitude. And that's really for safety separation purposes. Thank you for the question.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Eric. We have another question here that we'll pass over to Vicky. Vicky, they are asking how much it will cost the NPS to administer the plan, and will administration of the plan cut into the budget of the park?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that question. No, park budgets will not be affected by the air tour management plan, and no additional funding is needed to implement it. Thanks for the question.
Great. Okay. We have another question here that will go over to Eric. They're asking, how will the plan be enforced? i.e., if an operator flies at 800 feet versus the 15 to 2,500 feet, how will that be enforced, and who is responsible for monitoring the flight paths?
Thank you, Michelle. And again, thank you for that question. That's a really good question. And I think one of the benefits of this air tour management plan, because this air tour management plan requires operators to equip all of their aircraft that they use for air tours with flight monitoring technology. And they're required to report flight monitoring data as part of their semi-annual reports. The required flight monitoring data in this air tour management plan requires operators to include the following: latitude, longitude, geometric altitude, tail number, date and time stamps for each ping. Pings, I think, were set at 15 every 15 seconds, I believe. Operators and doing business as, aircraft type, certificate number. So all kinds of data now would be required with this air tour management plan, and then that would be accessible to the agencies. And then for aircraft, for operators who don't currently have such flight following technology, the ATMP requires them to obtain that within 180 days of the effective date. Some might already have that type of equipment, in which case they would be already in compliance with the air tour management plan. And as far as enforcement, or as far as determination of non-compliance, obviously the agencies would have access to this information, and we would have evidence or information to show whether or not the operators were flying in compliance. And we would handle that through the flight safety district offices, the local one, and it would be done in accordance with FAA Order 2150 compliance and enforcement program. But really good question, and that's why we're excited about this air tour management plan. It would allow us to get that data and check that. So thank you for that question.
Thanks for the answer, Eric. Okay. For this next question, we'll bring Brandon Ketchum back on. Brandon, the question is asking, why does the plan call for a 2,000-foot lateral avoidance of ranch operations, but only 1,000-foot lateral avoidance of nesting bird colonies?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, that's why we have drafts that we put out for comment and get feedback. So I would say that the lateral avoidance of the ranch core areas was really intended to limit direct overflights, which have occurred in the past over the permitted dairy operations and their associated residential uses. But that's certainly something that we're happy to look at and really look at lateral offsets being consistent across the board. So good catch, good comment, something that we can certainly take back and revise. Thanks.
And again, thanks for that clarification, Brandon. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes there's a bit of a lag between when the questions are coming in and when we can see them on our end. I feel like there probably are some more questions that are in the queue to come in on our end. So, so for now, we're going to go off camera and off mic just for a little bit to give you guys a chance to process maybe some of the things you've heard, see if you need clarifying context for maybe any of the responses we've provided so far. But we're planning to be here until 6 p.m. So again, please continue to submit your comments. Go off video here for just a little bit, and we'll come back in once you guys have had a chance to submit your questions. So thank you. If you happen to end up joining us a little late, I just wanted to provide a quick update. We are currently in the question and answer session of the public meeting for the draft air tour management plan for the San Francisco Bay area parks. Your questions can be submitted into a Google form using a link that FAA has posted into the chat feature of whatever social media platform you're using. There is a bit of a delay sometimes on our end between you submitting the questions and us being able to see them on our end. So just please continue to get your questions submitted. We'll be here live until 6 p.m. Pacific time, and we look forward to hearing from you. So hopefully we'll talk to you here in just a moment. Okay, great. Thank you. So we do have something here. We have a question that we'll pass over to Eric. So Eric, this is kind of a long question, and I'll try to read it slowly here. The commenter, the question is stating that I see no mention in the plan of the unique weather conditions along the California coast. In order to safely conduct flights while fog or other low-lying clouds are present, restricting flights to tightly defined routes and altitudes, you could inadvertently produce a significant risk to such flights and to people on the ground should those restrictions lead to accidents. Furthermore, by pushing such flights higher, you're potentially putting them in conflict with general aviation aircraft that are overflying the area. And they're asking if the FAA has studied how this plan could impact the safety of flight under the Class Bravo and Charlie airspace. So Eric?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for that question. So this draft ATMP, for the most part, incorporates existing routes flown by the two operators with some minor adjustments in regards to the altitudes at some locations for the protection of species and other resources in the park. As always, deviations from the routes for safety or weather concerns are always up to the pilot in command. This ATMP does not trump that. Furthermore, the Flight Safety District Office in Oakland, the FSDO, did take a look at this proposal, and that FSDO oversees the two operators at this park. And so, yes, they have taken a look at this from a safety perspective and have not found any issues. So, but thank you for that question. Very, very important safety always. Thank you.
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you, Eric. Okay, another question here. We'll pass over to Vicky. Vicky, they're citing the ATMP section 4.0 justification for measures taken, saying it describes no actual reason for establishing such a plan. And they're asking if the agencies have any documented problems with having aircraft and helicopters briefly fly past any of the locations in the park.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Under the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement is required when there are more than 50 air tours per year being conducted. And in this case, for the San Francisco Bay Area parks, 2 air tour operators applied for operating authority. They were doing tours at the time the act was passed in 2000. So they were issued interim operating authority by FAA back then. And so that application actually triggered the need to do the air tour management plan. So we're just fulfilling the requirements of NEPATMA. And then is regarding whether there are any documented problems with having aircraft and helicopters fly briefly by these locations. The justification for the altitudes and the routes is to protect the species that are in the area of the air tour management plan. So the measures that are in there are protective of those species, and also visitor experience. So that's how we've documented the need for those measures. Thanks for the question.
Okay, so we have about a little over 10 minutes left. We did have another question come in here, and it looks like we we'll go ahead and bring Bill Merkel back on to answer this question. So Bill, they're asking how the plan is responsive to fall migration with numerous species flying at higher altitudes, bird species. And a related question is asking if tour routes and altitudes impacting migratory my apologies, let me start over again. Will tour routes and altitudes impact migrating birds that are crossing the Golden Gate Channel? So thanks, Bill.
Again, thank you. We're looking more into this, but migrating raptors and other birds are definitely being considered. And we believe the current routes and minimum altitudes are protective. We do know that the FAA maintains a wildlife strike database, and we do feel like if we determine that impacts to migrating birds are occurring, we could make an adjustment to the draft plan, and we are, consulting with raptor and bird biologists to consider these issues.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill. All right, we've apparently reached another bit of a quiet period with our questions. I do believe that there are still some folks on the line. So we will go off camera again here just for a little bit. We have a little under 10 minutes left to submit questions. So give you a chance to maybe think through again the things you've heard, need clarification on the responses that we provided. Please type them in. In the meantime, I'm going to go off camera for a bit, but we'll be here waiting to hear from you. So talk to you in a second. as we just sit here waiting for other questions to come in, a simple reminder that your questions are submitted through the Google form that FAA has posted in the chat area of the platform that you're using. So really does look like maybe there hasn't been anything coming in, but we'll stick on here for a little bit, and please let us know if you have anything else you'd like to submit. Just a reminder for those of you on the line, it looks like there may still be a couple of folks out there. Might be one more question coming in, so we'll give it another couple of minutes and see what we get, and we'll be back on here in a moment. Okay, so it looks like we have two more questions to address here before we close out for the evening. So the first question will go over to Eric. Eric, they're asking, how will air tour operations affect the carbon footprint of the parks?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the question. In regards to the carbon footprint, in essence, this air tour management plan stands up existing conditions in regards to the operational levels. So there should not be any increases in the carbon footprint as a result of this air tour management plan. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. And the final question here, we'll wrap up with a response from Vicky. Vicky, they're asking, have the comments made about the air tour management plans at other national parks resulted in any changes to the plans? And if so, what type of comments were made and what type of changes were made?
Thanks for that question. That's a great question to close out our meeting with. We've received thousands of comments so far on the various ATMPs that have been out for public review. This is, I believe, the 12th draft air tour management plan. So since August, so we are currently reviewing all those comments, and we will take, after we get the comments on this plan too, this public comment period's open until November 15th. We'll take a look at all those comments coming in. If based on comments received, we'll consider making changes to individual plans based on the comments we get in. There might be some comments that could apply to all of the air tour management plans, especially if that was kind of like a global or template type of adjustment. So we will make any comments or changes as necessary. You're still undergoing, consultation for section 106 and section 7. So we will take a look at all those, make changes as necessary. Any justifications, and again, justifications are included in each air tour management plan, and we will publish the final air tour management plans on Pepsi, and hope that answers the question, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Vicky. And thanks to everybody who was able to be on the line tonight to help answer some of these really, really great and thoughtful questions. We're now at the end of the meeting here. And as I promised earlier, I'm going to be sharing an email address that you can use to reach out if you have clarifying questions. And if those of you are not paying attention online and are listening only, grab your pen. I'm going to read it out here in just a second. Just a reminder to go to the Parks Pepsi site, the park planning site, to review the FAQ document, find additional details about the draft ATMP, and also see more details about the map. And as promised, if you have a question that we didn't answer, you can email, I'm going to say it first and then I'll spell it out. It's goga_public_affairs@nps.gov. And so that is GOGA_PUBLIC public_affairs AFFAIRS at nps.gov. And if FAA could also drop that into the chat feature, that would be appreciated. I've mentioned this a couple of times, but that email address is for clarifying questions. If you need more information from the NPS or the FAA about the draft ATMP to help you submit a more substantive comment, that's what that address is being shared for. The link for the Pepsi site is displayed again here on this page, along with the mailing address that you can use for hard copy comments. And the comments need to be submitted on or before November 15th. And with that, thanks again for your participation. On behalf of both the FAA and the National Park Service, we look forward to hearing from you. We hope you have a good rest of your evening. Take care. Bye.